Bonjour et bienvenue, welcome to this new tour, France with Vero. You know, I like to take you off the beaten path. I like to show you places that not everybody sees in France, and tonight I am in one of them. This tour is special. I know I say that a lot. On my YouTube channel, France with Vero, you can watch over 300 of the tours I have filmed since 2020 in Paris and beyond. This one is special because in November of 2021, I came here after some pretty tough times, several lockdowns, a move from Paris to my new city tour. I came here and visited the site and decided that I had to come back. I had to come back and have it all to myself, explore it, and see it at night when it's really quiet. The only way to do this is to stay at the 4-star hotel that's on the grounds. It sits right behind me. You see it in the distance. So I did this today in April, 2.5 years later, booked myself a room, and it wasn't that expensive. Had a great day in the Anjou region. We are just 15-20 minutes away from Saumur here. And it's been a lovely day, but the highlight has been to be here, to stay here, to have dinner here once all the visitors are gone. And I am now going to take you on a little stroll and tell you a little bit more about the story of the famous Abbey de Fontevraud, Fontevraud Abbey. Behold the grounds after hours. Everyone's gone except for the people staying in that hotel. We have the place all to ourselves. Abbey de Fontevraud has been around for centuries. It was founded at the very start of the 12th century in the 1100s by a man called Robert d'Arbrissel. He was from Brittany. Robert d'Arbrissel was convinced that men and women had a role to play in society, which was pretty interesting at that time. When he died at the end of a long, long life, he assigned the job to a woman. A woman succeeded him. And after that, for almost 700 years, over 36 women, I believe, ruled what became the largest monastic city in Europe. 36 women, 36 abbesses, until the French Revolution. The last one, I think, left in 1792, just a few years after the storming of the Bastille. And then the same thing happened to Fontevraud that happened to all the churches in France. Everything was confiscated, sold off as public property if it wasn't ransacked and stolen. And then this incredible place had another career of sorts. In the 1800s, Napoleon I decided that this had to become a penitentiary, a prison. And as you can imagine, it took a lot of work and a lot of damage to this incredible place to be able to house prisoners here. This lasted until 1963. Until 1963, Fontevraud was known mostly as one of the toughest penitentiaries, jails in France. And then restoration came. They started working on it, bringing it back to its past glory, and it finally opened to the public. In fact, when it did, in the 80s, a lot of the prisoners were still around, working on the restoration effort. This is just an example in front of us of a building that's quite striking here, this incredible structure. You see all these chimneys on the roof? There's a lot of mystery about this structure. They think it was a kitchen for the abbey. They think maybe it was a smoking room because there are different fireplaces in there. They don't really know what it was, but this is one of the most striking structures you will ever see. So an incredible place, very rich history. It was well known all over Europe. And then it was over, and it became a state prison. And then it was restored and became a landmark, a historic monument of France, as well as a museum. We have a really fine museum of contemporary art here that opened just a few years ago thanks to a very generous donation by private collectors. So art and culture are always around here in Fontevraud, and interestingly, they were as well back in the Middle Ages, because some of the abbesses who ran the abbey were interested in the arts and culture and brought it here. An example of these abbesses would be Marie-Madeleine de Rochechouart. You may not know her name, but you know her sister's name. Her sister was the famous Madame de Montespan, who was the Sun King's favorite, Louis XIV. And so he assigned her sister, Madame de Rochechouart, and she became the lead abbess here. And she stayed here for almost 30 years. She was 25 when she was sent here to lead the abbey. It was almost as if they were holding literary salons here. She had plays performed here. And Louis XIV used to refer to her as the Queen of Abbesses. If you go through this door, there is a very interesting exhibit about the time Fontevraud was a state prison, one of the toughest in France. Very few people ever escaped it, if any. Now this is absolutely extraordinary because no one is around. The hotel guests are having dinner right now. It's almost 9 p.m. It's been a glorious day in April. Temps are still pretty warm now. And we have the place all to ourselves. I've already filmed a tour here and walked the grounds when I was here in November of 2021. It's kind of dark, I'm not going to do this, but ahead of us is the hill where the original settlers, when Robert d'Arbrissel founded this community for men and women alike, they used to live up on that hill in wooden shacks until they built the complex. I'm standing now outside the church, the famous church of the Abbey de Fontevraud. And this is what a lot of people come to see. This church and Fontevraud have become the necropolis, the main burial place for a family, a dynasty, I should say, who ruled Western Europe in the 12th century, the Plantagenêt dynasty. You've all heard the names Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard the Lionheart, Henry II of England. This is where they are buried. And it was Eleanor of Aquitaine who wanted it. So tonight, for a few minutes, I am taking you on a very special visit of this church that can be busy during the day. But tonight, we will be almost the only ones there. Now picture this church with its nave ahead of us, with different floors, 4 or 5 different floors, set up to house prisoners from the 1800s to 1963. Imagine the work it took to restore it to its glorious past. But today, how magnificent. Would you look at this? Now this type of architecture, those vaults, are known as the Angevin style from the Anjou region, and they look very high, very elegant. It's a bit of a different style from what you see in Gothic cathedrals in the northern part of France. Now, because the arts are always present and have always been present at Fontevraud, they often have exhibits. And right now, you can see in this church works by an artist. Here's his name. And he has set up several pieces of art throughout the church, the magnificent church. Here is one here. This looks like a young boy, dressed the way boys dress today, holding his own head. And this is, of course, a reference to the famous Bishop of Paris, who was martyred a long, long time ago, Saint Denis, who was eventually beheaded in Montmartre, north of Paris, and, according to the legend, picked up his own head and walked all the way to the northern section of Paris, where a basilica stands today, Basilica Saint-Denis, which is the necropolis of all French kings. And this takes us back to the Plantagenêt dynasty. It's hard to say what would have happened if Eleanor of Aquitaine, probably one of the most famous queens of the Middle Ages, hadn't married Henry, the heir of the County of Anjou, who became King of England. Eleanor, who first married a French king, then divorced him, and remarried Henry. Eleanor, who became Queen of France first, then Queen of England. And between her possessions as the heiress of the Duchy of Aquitaine, which was all of western and southwestern France, and the possessions of Henry, the Plantagenêt owned all of Western Europe, from Scotland all the way to the Pyrenees. Back in the day, there would have been more tombs here, but today we only have 4 recumbent statues. All the other ones are gone. And I'll get back to these, in a while. You can see the artist has placed blue glass books all around the statues because they tell the stories of the mighty Plantagenêt, who fought it off for decades with the kings of France, known as the Capetian kings, planting the seeds for what would become much later the 100 Years' War. I'd like you to look at this. We still have some pigments on the walls. And we've got to imagine this church, just like the French cathedrals in the past, with painted walls inside, outside. Now, of course, pristine, much different. But they have been able to restore some of the colors on these walls. You see. This is quite spectacular to see in such an old church. Modern art. Impressive. There's a crypt behind the structure in the back here. You can visit the crypt, which is where the church really started. This is so impressive. The statue above my head is projecting itself on that wall, the shadow. Back to the Plantagenêt. Eleanor, a beautiful, educated young woman, heiress of the Duchy of Aquitaine, first gets married to the French king, Louis VII. They were not a good match. She gave him 2 daughters. They eventually separated, and a few months later, she had found a new husband, the young heir of the County of Anjou, Henry, who was 10 years younger than she was. Allegedly, their marriage was a passionate one, at least in the first few years. In a little over 13 years, she gave him 8 children. 5 of them were boys. Several became kings of England. But things went downhill. Henry was ambitious. He was a bit of what we would call a control freak, didn't really trust his children, and eventually the sons rebelled against the father, and the mother supported them. She was punished, had to live in exile of sorts for many years until Henry's death. He died in Chinon, nearby, in the Touraine region. And at that point, Eleanor decided to have a place where the Plantagenêts could be remembered. A few years later, she was crushed to lose her favorite son. There he is, Richard the Lionheart. He died in her arms. She buried him here as well. The woman on the other side is the wife of another of her sons, King John, who was the last Plantagenet king to rule. Her name was Isabelle of Angoulême. She's lying next to, in fact, her brother-in-law, Richard the Lionheart. When Eleanor died, she was 80 years old, which was a long life at the time, and she was active until the very end of her life, and she was buried here as well. In her late 70s, she still had a lot of energy and ambition. She traveled all the way to Spain, where her daughter had married the King of Spain, to make sure that one of her granddaughters could come back to France and marry a French king. She chose Blanche. Blanche was her granddaughter. She came to France, married a king known as Louis VIII. You may have heard her name when you visit the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. You hear about Saint Louis, who was known as Louis IX. Blanche de Castille was his mother. And in that sense, Eleanor of Aquitaine is referred to as the grandmother of Europe, because her bloodlines run through many countries. She made sure of that. She really was indomitable. And thanks to her, we have this place that has survived the revolution, that has survived becoming a state prison. And there they are, the last recumbent statues, the last of the Plantagenets in France. Now, I don't know what she would think about what I am saying right now. I hope she's smiling, but look at how she is represented. Henry next to her is the king. He has a crown on his head, he's holding a scepter, and Eleanor is represented holding a book, a Bible. She was very educated, which was unusual for women at the time, and she was proud of it. If you read her story, you realize what an incredible woman she was and what odds she overcame. I think that, most of all, she had what the French refer to as panache. Now, one thing before I step outside. Do you notice something if you look at both their statues? Do you notice how hers is higher? I'm pretty sure that's on purpose. We will leave the Plantagenets now. And again, we are the only ones here. I hope you've enjoyed this tour. In the video notes, I will link up the other tour I filmed in November of 2021. I walked the entire complex, or at least on the outskirts of it, so you will be able to see more. And I will link it in the video notes, so make sure to watch that as well. I want to thank France with Vero patrons, my co-producers, for helping me plan and take those trips that enable me to film those tours. We're going to walk through those big doors and let them rest. If you want to do what I did, you can stay at the hotel at the Abbey. It's a 4-star hotel with a wonderful restaurant. 1 star, Michelin. You can also do picnic baskets, which is what I did, prepared by the restaurant, and you can enjoy them in the gardens or in your room. It's very dark out there. Time for me to say à bientôt. If you've enjoyed this tour, please give this video a big like, subscribe to my YouTube channel, share with friends. And if you'd like to support my small business, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/francewithvero. You'll treat yourself to some exclusive content, and you'll be joining a pretty fun community of Francophiles. You can also subscribe to my newsletter. It's free on Substack. For now, one last peek at the church and the Plantagenêts resting. À bientôt les amis.